So it's hour 3. We're going to keep working with Connect. We're going to add some other packages. And then we'll get into our lab. So we have our server running, but we have this cannot get problem. So what we need to do is we need to set up, we want to set up a hello function, and then we want to dispatch or call that function when we get a request. So I'll create a variable called hello, which is equal to a callback function. But in Connect, look like in Connect. We get 3. We get a REQ, which is the HTTP request, the RES, which is the HTTP response, so what we want to send back to the browser. And then there's this optional third parameter called next. So if we want something else to happen after, we can then call that function. We won't really worry about next. We're really just going to deal with request and response for now. We'll get to the request later in the course. So we put in our 3 parameters that are built into Connect. All we want to do is send a hello world response to the browser and end the response. So we can call res for response, res.end. So we've now set up a way to send a response back. We didn't have this before. We have that cannot get message. The other thing we want to do is we now need to call that function. So when we get a request in, we want that function to run. So we want to execute hello function when requests come in. So we'll use our app object, our Connect, our instance of a Connect object, and if we call app.use, what this means is execute that function when we get a request. So our browser should no longer say cannot get, it should say hello world when we try this out. So this is basically our request handler. Write a function and then tell our application to use that function. Now my server's still running here. We've made a bunch of changes. Back to my browser, I've saved my changes, but we still have cannot get. What will we need to do in order to see if that new code that we've added worked? Why is it still saying cannot get?
The server is still running on the old code.
Right. Once you launch the server, it's using the old code. Doesn't matter if we change versions. If I stop my server with Control-C, and then if I press the up arrow to run the last command, so node server, relaunch it, my server's now running again. And now my hello world function is running. So it doesn't matter what path I call, it runs, that function executes. So now you should be getting hello world. Now this is just the starting point. The problem is we get the same response no matter where we go, right? We've built a single response application. Our application needs to be able to send different responses depending on the URL the user's asking for. They can't all just say hello world. So let's set up what we want is we want it, if the user goes to localhost 3000/hello, they get this. If they go to localhost 3000/goodbye, it should say goodbye world instead. So what will we need to do in our code to make this happen? We'll have to do a couple of things. Okay, so one thing is we're going to have to figure out which URL did they ask for. What's the other thing we'll need to add here? Yeah, we'll need a separate function, a separate goodbye function. And then we need to map or dispatch. If they go to /hello, call hello. If they go to /goodbye, call the goodbye function instead. So we'll write a goodbye function. And then we'll have to deal with the problem that every time we make a change, we have to stop and restart our server. We'll want to install a utility package that will restart our server automatically when we save changes. So this time we'll send a response. My world. Now we've set up two different code paths, two different things our application might do. The problem is app.use executes every time still. So we need to handle those different requests, those different URLs. We need to parse the URL out as Prashant suggested. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to add a parameter on line 20. Instead of calling hello all the time, we only want to call it at that URL. So if the user goes to localhost 3000/hello, then execute hello. So what would we need if we want to execute the goodbye function? Yeah, same thing, same line repeated with app.use. If they go to goodbye, we'll call goodbye. So stop your server, restart it, and then try localhost 3000/hello, localhost 3000/goodbye, and then try localhost 3000 something else and see what you get. So goodbye worked. Did hello work? What happens if you go just to localhost 3000 to the root with nothing? Cannot get, right? So we've set up dispatchers or root handlers for those two URLs. I'll stop and restart again. So goodbye works. Hello works. The root folder, we haven't set that up. Something else, again, doesn't know what to do. So how could we handle this problem? That's a great idea. So, and what should happen at the generic? So hello. At hello, they get hello world. At goodbye, they get goodbye world. So we maybe also want one other, like a fallback function or a generic one, in case they hit some URL that we don't have a specific response for. So we'll call this, I like that. We'll just call it generic. And in this one, we'll just send in some kind of, you reached, whatever the message says, something general. So Jesse, where should we put that line? You're right, we'll need an app.use generic with no path. right? Where should we put it? What line number should I add that code?
25 or 22, like above after I use solo.
Okay.
It doesn't matter.
Well, let's put it here. So with generic, we're not specifying any path. This is all the other URLs except /hello or except /goodbye. We can, but that's our fallback. Let's try this and see what happens. What do you get? So try going again, stop and restart. Try your hello URL, try your goodbye URL, try your root URL. What happens?
It just takes you right to you reach localhost.
Right, it runs the generic one every time.
Yeah.
We're on the right track, so I'll just stop and restart. Even when, right. So something else, okay, that's good. There's my generic. Take out the URL. It's good. Whoops. I didn't get my hello response. And I didn't get my goodbye response. So there's a quick and easy way to fix it.
Put it after hello goodbye.
Right. So your actual instinct on line 25 was actually correct. I'm not trying to make you look bad. I wanted it to run there so that it's important you can see, that everybody could see what happened. Our generic or our default, our fallback, that should happen at the end. Otherwise, it overrides those specific paths. So move it down to the bottom and one more time, stop, restart. Stopping and restarting is becoming a pain, right? We'll fix that next. So now that our generic is last, okay, good. Goodbye works. Hello works. And then our fallback is only if it didn't find another route first. Didn't find any matching URLs, then it will run our generic function. So that's what we want.
It shows me the error that cannot read the property end of
Check your code carefully, Genevieve, with what I have. So this is how we set up using Connect. This is how we set up URLs, right? There's no actual real pages here. They're like virtual pages. We just interpret a URL and we send a different response based on the path. When we use Express next week and we start doing Express routing, it's going to look similar. Here, I'll show you a completed application, what some of this routing might look like. So here we've got the route. So this is Express code. We use route or get. So at the root, it runs a query on the database. And then this res.render, that is displaying a view. So this is our model view controller. This is the controller. Take a route where we have a get, run this database query and load this view in the browser. If we have a post at /add, we're going to save the data and redirect. Right? This is where we're going and what we'll be doing. So this is us handling these different routes with Express. So a little more complicated, but this is, so what we're doing today, we'll build into that over the next few weeks. Okay. All right, now I want to make a couple more changes to this. Basically, we have it working, but I want to add an auto restart utility to our application to make our life easier. Okay. So let's stop the server one more time. And we want to install this utility I'll bring it up quickly on NPM, on the NPM site. It's called Nodemon. It's a monitor script for use during development of a Node application. So what Nodemon does is it watches all the files in our application, and if any of them have been changed, it will automatically restart for us. Great, that's what we want. So let's do, now with Nodemon, this is a development utility. We don't just want it to use for lesson 3. We want Nodemon installed globally on our system so we can use it every week. And whenever we start an application and make changes, we want Nodemon to restart it for us. So this time we'll do npm install -g for global. We'll install Nodemon this way. So our application code doesn't depend on a version. We're just using this for development. npm install -g Nodemon. It's not big, it won't take long. But it's installing it globally so we can use this every week. There's no dependencies of Nodemon. Well, there were optional dependencies which it skipped, which is fine. See this in node modules. So where did it get installed? Right here. In my users, my username, app data, roaming, and npm. That's where you'll find that package. So as long as I'm logged into this computer with the R. Freeman account, I can use Nodemon. If I log in with a different user account though, I'd have to reinstall it because it's installed specifically for my user profile. So now if we want to run this, there's two ways we could use Nodemon. The first way and the easy way, if we want to run our application again, instead of starting it with Node, we'll start it with the Nodemon process. So let's try this. Type Nodemon server. Launch the application, but now we're using our node monitoring tool instead of the original node process. Notice it starts up and it says I'm watching all files for changes. My application's running, so I should be able to hit my hello, goodbye, connect, it's all running again. But now watch what happens when we make a change. In my generic function, I'll say, and Nodemon is running. I'm going to save changes to my JavaScript. I'll save those changes. And Nodemon says that it's restarting. So now when I go back to my generic page and refresh it, I now get the new version. Nodemon restarted. So no more stopping and starting every time I want to change something and check it. Nodemon will also check, basically it recompiles things. So if I do this, so my code's working, it's running. Then I make a syntax error and save that change. And let's say I don't happen to notice that my editor is giving me a little red line here. Nodemon tries to restart, and now it tells me I've got a syntax error. So now my application will actually be offline. It's not going to connect anymore. Site can't be reached. So this will help us catch errors Nodemon will help us catch errors before users get them, potentially. As soon as I fix that, click save, Nodemon restarts, gets my message that I'm up and running again. So we'll use this utility all the time. Now that's one way of starting it with Nodemon. There is another way I'm going to show you, and you can use either way. Eventually, when we use Express, we're probably going to use this second way. I will stop it one more time. my application's dead, my server's off. We can also start it, excuse me. If I go into package.json, inside of the scripts section that has its own array, I can tell NPM to start my application using Nodemon every time. So if I put in a comma here and add in start, and I say start with Nodemon and launch server.js as my startup file. So I've added what you see in blue. When we use Express, Express is going to write this into package.json for us, but it's going to say node instead of Nodemon. If we want to use Nodemon, we just have to add MON on the end of the word node. And now we'll use a slightly different command. I'll type CLS to clear this out. Now if I use npm start, this does the same thing. Starts the application running, but it will use, when it calls start, it looks in here what the startup process is and what the startup file is. So if I run npm start, it's running again and it's using Nodemon, so it's watching for changes and will do auto restarts. Now I should be back online. So either of those methods will work when we've installed Nodemon. So we want this globally because we'll use this every week. We don't want to just have this utility for lesson 3. It's useful all the time for Node. Save changes and restart so we can go and check them. So you may find some other tools. Most of the NPM packages we install, we're just going to want to install locally for a particular application. One of the other ones we'll probably install globally is called Mongoose, because Mongoose is a package that lets our Node application talk to a MongoDB database. So it's useful to install globally because probably most of our Node applications are going to use MongoDB. So we'll install that one globally as well in a few weeks. And does anybody have any questions about using Nodemon or using Connect, what we did so far? Jacob?
Just wondering, so as far as the response not end function with that, can we link that to like an HTML file?
Yes, so eventually when we use Express, rather than just printing out messages, we wanted to actually, with this MVC model, what we actually really want to do is we want to display a view. An HTML file, well, it'll have a different extension. We'll create a file with HTML and CSS, and we'll want to, when we get a certain request, load that page. Actually, you know what? Let's do that. Okay. So instead, click new HTML file. Let's call this one, we'll call it default.html. We'll use this for our generic response instead of just printing out a message. We'll just put on this is the default page. Lesson 3. It's a good question. So instead of just sending some text response, we actually want to load an HTML. We want to load a view. Just put on some generic text. You know, obviously we can do whatever we want. We can add JavaScript, we can add CSS, we can do all that stuff. So now let's comment out this line, that res.end. And instead, we're going to call the res., well, we'll see if it works. It's not coming up. We'll see if it works. If we call res.render, this may not work with Connect, but it'll work next week with Express. And let's try We'll see what happens. Oh, yeah, it would probably help if I called it the right name. Thank you. And when I save those changes, Nodemon's restarted. So now the question is, oh, hello works. If we just go to the root, res.render, it's not the right function. Let's look quickly in the connect documentation and see what the function we would want. When we use express, that's the function. It's going to be res.render, but connect is, or maybe the docs are in here. Doesn't tell us much here. Let's take a quick look and see if we can find the right method for connect. Come on. So that's clearly not the method we want. Maybe we can find something in here. I don't know. I may have to look that one up for next week. It's a good question. Although next week we won't be using. Let's try res.load. See if that works. No, not a function. I'm not sure. Next week we'll use connect. Sorry, we'll use express, which sits on top of connect. So I'll just leave that one out for now. Question mark. Good question. Sorry, I don't have a better answer for you today. We'll figure it out. Okay, I want to make one more file and then give you your lab. Okay. Actually, you know what? We don't even need it. Do we need another file for this? Let me just think about this. No, we don't need another file. We can do it right in here. Let's make one other function. We'll call this function calculate. We'll call it calculate tax. So here's what this function has to do. Put the comments in. We want to pass at the end of our URL, we want to pass a numeric value called subtotal. Then we'll want to take that number, we'll want to figure out how much tax would be and how much the total would be. And then down here, before our generic, we'll add a handler. If the user goes to calculate tax, we'll call that function. So we need to get the query string part of the URL. The query string is the list of parameters after a question mark, right? If we were using PHP, we would use $_get to read those variables. Obviously, in JavaScript, that's going to be different. In order to read that part of our URL, we need to make another reference to one of the built-in modules that ships with Node. We don't need an NPM package, but Node has a module that's installed on our machines called URL. We'll link to the URL module, parse URL parameters. Let's also link to the accounting package so that when we calculate the tax and total and we display all those values, we can format them as currency, as money. We'll also and you'll typically see this at the top of Node files, a whole bunch of require statements because we use packages so often. It's all modular. So Connect and Accounting are packages we've installed, and URL is part of the Node core. You install Node, you get the URL library. So what we want to do is when the user goes to a URL like this, I don't think my server's running. Oh, my server's running, we haven't finished the response. But that's, we want to grab that value, calculate the tax total, and then display them. So the first thing we need to do is let's create a variable. I'll call it QS for query string. So this is the parameter part of our URL. We're going to use the URL library that ships with Node. We're going to call the URL.parse method. So we're parsing our request.url. This will give us the part of the URL after the question mark. So the list of parameter names and parameter values. Sort of equivalent in PHP to the entire get string. And then I'll create another variable called subtotal. So now we're going to look through our entire query string and look for a key called subtotal and store that value in a variable. So this is how we can read values from our URL if there's parameters on the end of our web page address. We'll get the query string, and then we can refer to any item in the query string by the name of that key.
Can you explain line 13, like for this parse request URL dot comma?
Okay, here's the URL we're going to have. So this is what our URL is going to look like when we call this function. When line 30, it's now line 31, when it runs, what it will do is it will take everything after the question mark. It will give us that value. So QS will be equal to this whole thing in blue. Those are parameters passed to the page. So we have one parameter, and the name of that parameter is subtotal. Okay? So line 31 gives us the whole thing. Line 32 gives us the value of the subtotal parameter. So we have a parameter called subtotal with this value. So this is read the subtotal parameter name and put the value in a variable. So after this executes, subtotal will be how much? What will the value of subtotal be? Right, you got it. Okay. So this is just, if it was PHP, we would just have $_get subtotal, right? And that would give us, that's the equivalent. Except here we have to break it into two steps. First, we have to get this whole string because there might be more parameters. So this gets the entire list of parameters and values. And then we can refer to each parameter by its name.
It could be the one that user types, right?
Yeah, so this is the, right, that's where they're going to go. So this function will run at that URL because we've mapped it here. When they call calculate tax, run that function. And this function expects a query string at the end. Okay. So now we need to do two simple math calculations. Let's calculate tax. We also want to make sure we're dealing with numbers. So probably a good idea to convert our subtotal, make sure it's a floating point number. If we multiply it by 0.13, right, that'll give us the amount of tax, at least here in Ontario, 13% tax. To get the total, we can just add the subtotal and tax together. So we'll do a simple adding function. So now we have three numeric values. The subtotal from the URL, the tax amount, which is 13% of that, and the total where we're just adding the tax on to that subtotal. And now we want to send all three values, print them all out in a response to the browser. So we use res.end. We'll just kind of build a string. So we'll print out our subtotal and a new line. Well, we don't want console log. We want it in the browser. If we print console log, it will work, but the result will show up in the command line. We want the response to show up in the browser, right? So we need to use the response object for that. Shiva?
Will it not be subtotal? Parse float and the brackets you have to override.
Sorry, here?
No, I mean variable total is equal to parse float text plus.
Yes, thank you. Very good point. Good catch. That needs to be subtotal instead. I used the wrong variable. Thank you. So then a new line. And then our total. And that bracket should come out. Sorry about that. That goes at the end.
when you're doing bar taxes, parse float subtotal, would that not already be a float? So would you need to do parse float tax? Like a new float?
Anybody want to take a stab? That's a very good question. Anybody want to take a stab at that? We talked about data types in JavaScript last week. Why is it a good idea? Why have I converted? Why have I explicitly called parse float here? It's JavaScript, strongly typed, weakly typed, or untyped. Jonathan? It's weakly typed. So this is just a variable. JavaScript will guess what the type is.
I know that, but like the total, would it, because, oh, I guess subtotal's not owned.
We'll probably be okay here because it's going to do multiplication. But there's a chance here when we're adding, if it interprets those as strings, it might concatenate them.
Would it not know that tax?
We'll try it and see. You know what? We'll run it this way and then I'll take them out and we'll see. Maybe. So let's save that. Nodemon should restart. Our code compiles, which is good. So now if I go to localhost 3000, I'll put the code back up in a minute. I just want to see how we're doing so far. Calculate tax subtotal equals 99.99. There are our outputs. There's our tax and our total. If I change that to 100, just so we know the math is correct, put in a nice round number. Let's come to your question and see. What happens if I take out the parse float calls? Is JavaScript smart enough to know and treat these like floats?
I know that like the subtotal we have to parse the subtotal, but because tax, it already knows that tax is a float. I in total have to parse the float from something that would already be a float.
Well, let's first just see what happens this way. So without parsing the float here on the total, notice what it gave me for total. It actually appended them as strings. It didn't treat them as numbers. So for safety, we're probably best. And sorry, where were you suggesting we could leave it out? Here?
Like under the tax.
So here I could take it.
No, like under total equals partial tax.
Your next column tax. Yeah,
It is. It already thinks that tax is a float because we have a float multiplying by the float.
Okay, we could try it like that. Let's see. Yep. So it's okay. As long as we've parsed it as a float, at least in one place, it'll work.
That's what I was.
Now, the other thing last thing we want to do is we want to use our format money function from the accounting package. So these show up as dollars and cents, right? Our outputs don't look very good. We've already required accounting at the top, so now we can use it. Accounting dot format money. And I'll call that function 3 times. We'll format each of our 3 values.
So a kind of question to expand upon that. If you answered this last week, I'm sorry, I wasn't last week. But would Node or JavaScript just assume that it's a string if you don't specify?
It's hard to know what it will do. It tries to infer the data type, but it won't always infer it correctly, which is why we're best off casting it if there's any doubt. Right now we've got 3 numeric values. And now they're rounded as well to 2 decimal places. So that's the result. we wanted. Okay, I want to show you your lab quickly. I'll push all my code to GitHub in a minute, and I think there is a class in here, so we can't stay. I do have office hours. If you want help, you're welcome to come to office hours, but I do have to go to my office because I have a student who booked an appointment for 11 o'clock today. So here's your lab. It's due Sunday night. Some of you looked at it already. It's similar to the calculator function you just did. Okay. So you need to make a lab 3, make a new project. Don't just add the lab to this one. I want you to make a new project, initialize NPM, do the NPM in it. So I want to see the package.json there. Okay. Use Nodemon to start your application. Nodemon's installed globally. So use Nodemon. So what we did in package.json, so it runs with Nodemon. You have to create one JavaScript file, call it server.js, and you'll want to install Connect as well. You'll use Connect to run your server just like we did today. Okay. So we wrote a calculator, the calculate tax we just did, it had one parameter, right, called subtotal. The version you're making in lab 3, it has 3 parameters. The first parameter is called method. The second parameter is X, and the third parameter is Y. So what your code needs to do is to start the server, read the query string with that. So you can use that exact same line of code on line 31. Okay, it will give you that whole thing in blue. And in our code for right now, we had one variable, right? We had one query string variable called subtotal. You'll have 3, a method variable, an X, and a Y. X and Y will be numbers, and method will be one of 4 values: add, subtract, multiply, or divide. So then you'll need an if or a switch statement in your code. So if I go to this URL, you need to then perform an addition and display that result in a res.n, send that back to the browser. Okay? So if I go to this URL, this is what I should see on the page. If I go to this URL, but I change the method to subtract, you run a different calculation. And then the same for multiply and divide. Okay, so you'll have 4 different calculations in your code, but you only execute one calculation depending on the value of method in the URL. Okay, so all the code we did today you can use in order to do your lab. Won't take you very long. So new application with Nodemon and Connect, and a one-page script server.js file. Okay, I'm going to stop my stream. You had a question?
Are we allowed to use any other modules? Like, for example, email?
You can use other modules.